I returned home late in the evening when the sky was already almost completely dark, and the streets were lit by the faint glow of street lamps. I hardly noticed how I had flung the door open, and only the sound of the jingling keys brought me back to reality. They struck the table, and the metallic clink sounded empty, much like everything around me. The house was unusually quiet, not the usual silence, the kind that brings calm when you realize the whole world has left you in peace. This silence was heavy, and it seemed to hang in the air, filling the space with every step, every breath. I hadn't expected to find him at home, though I couldn't imagine where he could be. But now it didn't matter. Everything had become different. We both knew that, and even though nothing had been said out loud, the silence around us confirmed it. Something had changed. I took off my coat and threw it on the chair, not caring that it might get wrinkled. He was sitting in the living room by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. Calm, as always. He didn't even turn his head towards me. I noticed how his gaze briefly lifted to me, but he quickly turned away as if he didn't want me to notice. I quietly walked over to the chair and sat down, without a word. Minutes stretched like eternity, but not a single word escaped from either his or my lips, as if we didn't exist. Just two people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. We didn't speak, didn't search for answers or explanations. I thought about what was happening, but at that moment, it seemed that thoughts were meaningless. There was no need to explain anything. We both knew what had happened between us, and we both knew that returning to what had been before was no longer possible. He was sitting by the window, as always, with a cup of coffee in his hands. Silent. Outside the glass, the city lights slowly passed by, blurred in the fog and the rainy evening light. There was something in his gaze, confusion, unease, or perhaps something deeper, but I couldn't quite understand. He didn't want me to see it. His eyes would quickly turn away every time he glanced at me, as if he was afraid of meeting my gaze. And I realized he wasn't ready to look me in the eye. And I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't say anything, didn't try to speak first. Too many words had already been said, too many unnecessary ones. Instead, I quietly and carefully sat in the chair beside him, and we continued to sit there, unable to summon the strength to break the silence. Only the noise outside the window and the faint crackling of a branch in the fireplace disturbed its heavy quiet. At that moment, the thought came to me. If only I could disappear as simply as those lights outside the window, dissolve into the foggy night without leaving a trace, perhaps it would be easier. But I couldn't. Not even then, when it seemed everything had already been shattered, and there was not even a shadow left of what had been before. I thought about us. Once, we knew how to be silent, but that silence wasn't out of despair, but out of agreement. We knew each other so well that words seemed unnecessary. Now the silence was different. It made me feel like a stranger in this house, a stranger in his presence. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. And I waited. And all this time, we had only one thing: the window through which we looked at the world without touching each other. I stood up from the chair without saying a word and headed to the kitchen. I needed something to snack on. Not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to occupy myself with something familiar, something simple so I wouldn't have to think. In moments like these, actions that once seemed mundane became a form of salvation. I opened the refrigerator, looked at the shelves, but couldn't focus. All I could hear in my head was the noise of thoughts, as if they couldn't find a place for themselves and were darting from corner to corner. I began to examine the packages, the prep items, the foods that had once brought joy, but now seemed so distant. He didn't offer to help. I hadn't expected him to. There was something in his eyes that told me he needed time. Or maybe he simply didn't know how to behave. Like that moment when we both ended up in this house, in this world, and every step, every movement felt out of place. I noticed how his hand rested on the table, next to the cup of coffee. It was such a small thing, but it triggered memories of the times when we used to cook dinners together, when his hands would wrap around my waist, and he'd quietly whisper that everything would be okay. when we weren't afraid of silence, but instead found comfort in it. I reached out to grab the yogurt, but I accidentally glanced at his hand again. It didn't move. He just sat there, as if he had dissolved into that place, into that time. We were here, but we weren't here at the same time. There was no warmth, no comfort, the kind I remembered. We both seemed to be playing some kind of role, trying to be who we once were, but couldn't anymore. There was alienation in his eyes, and I felt it. As my gaze swept over the kitchen, I noticed the details that had once been so important. These cups, which we had chosen as a pair because they seemed perfect to us, the frying pans on which we made omelets, these simple things that now seemed to hold no meaning. They couldn't bring back that day when we were just close, laughing at something trivial. I realized that all these objects already knew what had been happening between us. They were witnesses to the changes, even though they remained silent about it. I returned to the table with the yogurt in hand, opened it, and began eating, not knowing why. He remained sitting by the window, motionless, and I suddenly realized that his silence wasn't burdensome, but rather detached, restrained. He didn't try to comfort me, didn't offer his help. He was here, but he wasn't with us. And that was the most painful part. His silence was something we couldn't overcome, and I suddenly realized I couldn't do it on my own. Time had changed us. I felt a chasm growing between us. And despite the familiar home surroundings, this was a place that could no longer be a home. I closed the refrigerator, and the air in the kitchen became particularly thick, as if every item in the room knew what had happened between us. As if even the walls were absorbing this silence, holding it inside, not letting it go. When I returned to the living room, he was still sitting by the window, motionless, his shoulders slightly slumped, and his face showed exhaustion. But he didn't notice me. He wasn't here, not with me, not in this world. And I couldn't understand what had caused this silence. There were no accusations, no complaints, just the sense that we no longer existed in the same space. He was nearby, but as distant as the city outside the window, hidden in the night's gloom. All those things that had once been meaningful to us now seemed alien. The old books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, they had become part of a foreign world, one we no longer lived in. I felt the weight of this space, filled with familiar things, pressing down on me. The furniture, the dishes, the paintings, they knew everything. They remembered everything. But their silence was as heavy as his silence. And I couldn't shake the feeling that they had become witnesses to the happiness we once had. These things reminded me of what was lost and now no longer held any meaning. We both tried to act as if nothing had changed. He sat, and I sat, both trying not to acknowledge that everything between us had crumbled. But I knew that even if we didn't speak about it aloud, everything had changed. Every step, every glance now felt foreign. I noticed how his hand moved involuntarily when he picked up the cup. But that movement was no longer the same as it had been before. Now it was slow and cautious, as though he was afraid to disturb something, to say something. And at that moment, I felt that we were both desperately trying to hold on to something that could no longer be preserved. Every word I could speak now seemed inappropriate. Every movement, every glance, it all seemed too important. We could no longer afford the ease with which we used to be close. I remembered the moments when we laughed, when one look was enough to understand each other. Now we sat in silence, as if we couldn't find what connected us. And that silence was something heavy, like an inescapable reality that we couldn't change. I looked at him, and suddenly it became clear to me that we were both searching for something we couldn't find. He probably felt that chasm between us, that impossibility of going back. But he was silent, and I was silent. We both knew that returning to what was once was no longer possible. Silence filled every corner of this house, and I realized it wouldn't leave until we learned how to live with it. But I didn't know if I could. I went to the refrigerator, automatically grabbing the juice, as usual, but this time my movements became slow, like in some strange dream. My body acted without my thoughts, and I hardly noticed what I was doing or how. Thoughts seemed to get stuck somewhere in my head, and I couldn't make them move. They didn't follow me. I stood in front of the refrigerator and opened the door, but I didn't immediately understand what I was looking for. Everything seemed familiar. The products we bought, the packages, all of it should have brought comfort. But instead, I felt the small, imperceptible changes that had happened in our relationship creeping up on me, becoming tangible. I felt someone's eyes on me, and though I didn't turn my head, I knew he was still sitting by the window. I opened the juice and heard how the sound suddenly became loud and sharp. I noticed how his hand on the table slightly trembled. He didn't move, but it was noticeable. I saw his hand in the mirror, and it was too still to ignore, as if he was already not here, in this house. In that moment, I realized that his silence had become a part of us. He was nearby, but it was as though he was in another world. I took a couple of sips of juice, and it was strange. Such a simple action suddenly became so important that I felt a weight tighten inside me. It seemed like this small movement, this simple gesture, taking the glass, drinking, was the last thing I could do in this familiar life. I tried to pull a sense of normalcy from within myself, but it slipped away. Water, juice, all these simple things had lost their usual significance, even though they had always been such an important part of our days. It was like water flowing through your fingers, and you couldn't stop it because it was too natural, too constant. I suddenly realized that perhaps he felt the same way. He was no longer that figure close to me with whom I could share any silence, any movement. I felt how this inexplicable, stretched-out pause between us was becoming painful, but words couldn't fix it. We both sat in this house, but each of us was locked in our own space, and this space no longer had anything in common with what we once called home. I looked around the room again at the surroundings, the familiar details, and realized that despite all these things that hadn't changed, everything had changed. Nothing was the same as before, and the scariest part was, we knew it. We were both searching for a way back, but we couldn't find it. The morning came quietly, almost imperceptibly. I woke up earlier than usual, but I didn't feel rested. There was a strange feeling, as if not just the night had passed, but an entire life, and everything that had been before it suddenly became distant and unimportant. I lay in bed, unable to get up, thinking that this wasn't just fatigue, it was something more, something that had been building up inside me. I hadn't noticed how many small changes accumulate in life until the moment came when there was no room left for the familiar. When I finally got up and went to the bathroom, I noticed how the room greeted me with silence. Even the air felt heavy, and it seemed like I had stepped into an empty space, one that held nothing that could return to me the familiar sense of home. In the mirror, I saw my reflection, and for a moment, I thought I was looking at someone else. Something in my face had changed, and I couldn't quite understand what. It wasn't anything external, not wrinkles, not expressions. It was an elusive change in my gaze, in how I perceived myself. It was as though I was looking at myself through some distance, through someone else's eyes. And in that mirror, I saw the reflection of a person who no longer knew who they were. My movements were slow and aimless. I tried to tidy myself up, but every gesture, every touch of the mirror felt too loud in the silence that filled the house. He was still asleep, and for some reason, I felt like I was alone in the house. But it wasn't loneliness. It was as if we both had gotten lost in some moment in time, and now we couldn't find our way back. When I was done, I returned to the kitchen. Everything was as quiet as it had been yesterday. Outside the window, the light was slowly growing, but that light brought neither warmth nor hope. It simply was. I noticed his gaze. He was standing in the doorway, looking at me, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't with us. He was far away. And all that time while I was preparing breakfast, we were together, but each in our own world. And in his gaze, there was something I couldn't understand, but it felt familiar. It was confusion, uncertainty, the fear that everything might have been lost irreparably. When he came to the table and quietly sat next to me, The silence continued, uninterrupted, as if every step, every movement was too important to disturb this moment. We sat together, but couldn't find the point of intersection, couldn't find what once connected us. I felt it in his silent presence, and it felt so strange, so empty inside. He seemed like a stranger, and perhaps I had become a stranger to him as well. This day didn't promise any changes, but I felt how each word, each glance from him was becoming something impossible for me. We tried to be close, but the distance between us was such that I couldn't step over it. I went to the kitchen to ask if we needed to go out somewhere. Not because I wanted it so badly, but simply because something had to be said, something had to be done, to break the silence that was becoming more and more unbearable. He looked at me, but his gaze was distant, unfocused, as though he were far away in some other place, and I was just a part of that spatial rift. "Do you want to go out?" I asked, trying not to let my voice tremble, trying to sound like usual. He looked at me with a slight bewilderment, as if I had asked a question he didn't know the answer to. There was no irritation, no desire to understand, just some confusion that I didn't like. He was near, but completely not near. "Yeah, probably," he said, then immediately turned away. It was as though he didn't know what to expect from me, or how we were supposed to act at that moment. Wordlessly, he stood up and went to the door, as if it were natural, moving out of old habit, but without any real meaning. I couldn't understand what was happening to us. We went to the store. At first, we walked in silence, and I noticed how his body seemed to have become mute, detached. His movements had lost their ease, becoming uncertain, as if each one required effort. I walked beside him, but we were so distant, as if there was an invisible wall between us, one that couldn't be seen but was felt with every movement, every glance. We hardly spoke at all. He was occupied with his thoughts, and I with mine. I tried to focus on something that could return to normal, but at that moment, it seemed like nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Everything felt foreign. We moved among the shelves of goods, like two people lost in the same space but unable to find each other. We were going about our business, but both of us felt how the distance between us kept growing wider. And then, just when I had almost gotten used to the silence, he suddenly walked up to the coffee shelf and grabbed a pack of the same brand we always used to buy. He held it in his hands and said softly, almost like a whisper, "Do you remember?" Those words hung in the air. They weren't an accusation nor a reproach. It was just a reminder of something long gone. He didn't even look at me, but there was something warm in his voice. Something that seemed like we could find something in that moment. But when I saw his face, I understood that this gesture hadn't brought me back. I stood in front of him, and in that moment, I felt how everything that once had been simple between us was now lost. We tried to return to those days when such small gestures, such simple words as, "Do you remember?" were not just memories, but a real part of us. But that moment, like everything else, had become part of the past, too distant and unattainable. That coffee in his hands, nothing more than a package of a product, familiar and habitual, but carrying the same weight as each of our days, which now were simply reminders that we could no longer be the way we once were. We returned home in silence. This time, I felt it much more strongly than before, as if it had become something tangible, something that penetrated every particle of the space. We came in, left the bags in the kitchen, but no one rushed to do anything. We didn't immediately take off our coats, didn't hang up our outerwear as we used to. He stopped by the door, as if waiting for something that wasn't there. I walked past, casting a quick glance at him, and immediately went to the bedroom. I couldn't even pretend that everything was fine. He stayed in the doorway, just like before. But now that threshold between us was no longer physical. It was within us, in every step, in every breath, in the way we could no longer return to what had once been unshakable. I didn't turn around, but I felt his gaze follow me, like an invisible thread, as if he was still trying to hold me back. But I knew it was pointless. The room, like always, was filled with ordinary things, but now they felt foreign, alien to us. These things spoke of us, of how we once lived, as if they had only stayed in memory in some other time. The comfort that had once been here was gone, and in its place was an empty space. We both tried to find something familiar, something that could bring us back to the time when every corner of this house was filled with joy and light, but it wasn't there. I returned to the living room, sat on the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had both ended up in some trap, one with no way out. I looked at him, and he looked at me, but it wasn't the same. We both knew that all these glances, all these words we could have said, could not bring us back. Every word now held too much weight, and I couldn't bring myself to say it. Whatever I said, it could become the last. Time seemed to have stopped, but at the same time it was moving at double speed, as if all the moments we had shared together were now slipping away quickly, disappearing from our lives. We were both here, in the same house, but each in our own world. The silence in the room was deafening, and I felt how it filled the space, replacing all the feelings that had once been on the surface. I stood up and walked toward the door. I couldn't stay here anymore, couldn't keep pretending that everything was still the same as before. His gaze was on me. I could feel it, but I couldn't stop. I needed to be alone. I needed to leave, at least for a while, to understand what to do next. We both knew that returning to what had been was impossible. We could no longer be who we once were. I left without looking back, and probably at that moment I realized that this house would never again be the place I once called home. It was a farewell that didn't need words, just silence, which spoke for us. Evening came, but it didn't bring relief. I was left alone in this house, filled not only with empty sounds, but also with memories that now felt as heavy as stones. He was nearby, but I felt how his presence became even more distant. He was trying to return to those moments when everything was different, when his voice was warm and his hands were familiar and comforting. He did something, like old habits, as if he was about to say something, do something that reminded me of the old days, but every effort only highlighted how foreign it all had become. I couldn't bear it. I could no longer look at his face and see the person I once knew, the one with whom I shared every moment of life, with whom we laughed, made plans, believed we could do anything. But all of that was gone, and I realized it with every passing moment, with every glance. I approached him, and perhaps he felt that something had changed. He waited, but I could no longer pretend. I looked at him, and in his eyes there was something that made it clear to me at once. He also understood that we could not continue like this. We were both trapped in a corner by this silence, this invisible barrier that was becoming stronger. And maybe it was at this moment that I realized I could no longer stay here, in this house, in this space. I need to be alone, I said, and couldn't hold back the tremor in my voice. It wasn't just words, it was a decision I hadn't made right away, but now it was inevitable. I felt his gaze change for a second, as if he understood that everything he had tried to return had turned out to be too fragile. He didn't answer. He just stayed silent, and I knew that, at that moment, nothing else mattered. He didn't try to stop me, didn't try to hold me back. We both knew that it was time to let go. I left the room, gathered the things I needed, and didn't look back. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I felt as if the air around me became lighter, but that lightness didn't bring relief. It was the end, and in this end, there was nothing beautiful, nothing that could comfort me. Just emptiness. I left without looking back. I didn't think about what would remain in this house, what I was leaving behind. All the memories that once filled it had now turned into a heavy burden that I could no longer carry. And perhaps, at that moment, I realized I would never be the person I was before. Everything had changed. Everything had been destroyed. And I could no longer go back. The evening was dark and endless. I walked through the streets, but my steps were quiet, and they didn't bring me peace. I didn't know where I was going. There was only the feeling that I needed to leave, to abandon all of it, to leave behind this house, these walls, these memories. I couldn't stay any longer in a place where everything reminded me of what was no longer there. He remained in the house, and though I didn't look back, I knew he was still there, perhaps silently enduring everything that had happened. I felt his presence even in the empty space I had left behind, but his silence was no longer mine, and that was something new. He stayed in what we had built, while I stayed in what I had destroyed. Everything I thought would stay with me now felt too heavy to carry. With each step, I felt time continue to pass, stretching between me and everything that had once been mine. Images flashed through my memory. His face, his laugh, the moments when we felt invincible. Now, those moments felt like they belonged to someone else, as if they had never existed. And the farther I walked, the further away the world where we had once been happy became. I thought about how long I had tried to preserve it all. Preserve us. Preserve the house. Preserve the habits. But at some point, I realized I couldn't. I could no longer pretend that everything would be as it once was. We had both lost something important, and it could never be returned. My steps grew faster, and I realized I was no longer afraid. The fear was already behind me. But everything ahead was uncertain. I didn't know what awaited me. Maybe it would be another life, another home, other people. But I knew I wouldn't be able to return to the person I had been before. I left everything behind, but still felt how it pulled me back. It wasn't leaving. It was more like running away from something I could no longer understand. And at that moment, I realized I no longer belonged to myself. Time passed, and I still couldn't find the answer to the main question. What happened? At first, it was hard even to understand that this wasn't just the pain of loss, that it wasn't just a reaction to change. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of losing myself. And more importantly, I realized that I wasn't returning to that house not because I couldn't forgive him or myself, but because I had lost something much more important. I walked through new streets, not looking back. The world around me continued its usual course, but I was no longer a part of that familiar rhythm. Inside me, there was the feeling that I had lost my bearings. Thoughts that once gave me clarity now seemed blurry, disconnected from one another. But at some point, when my steps no longer seemed so heavy, when the air lightened, I realized I'm living again. Not in that house. Not with those memories. Not with him. I learned to search for my path again. I began noticing things that I had once ignored. Music, scents, conversations with people I would never have talked to before. Life, which once seemed empty and foreign to me, now opened new horizons. I understood that everything that had happened, even if it was painful, had led me to learn how to be myself. Not in the past, not in the relationships that were already over, but here and now. Sometimes walking through the streets, I still felt a faint shadow of what had been lost. But there was no longer any regret, no more attempts to return. I accepted it as part of my story, as something necessary for me to become who I am now. I still couldn't say that I had fully rid myself of this feeling of emptiness, but I no longer feared it. I was learning to live with it, accepting that everything changes and that nothing is permanent. And perhaps the most important thing I learned during all of this is that I hadn't lost myself. I had simply learned to let go. Life went on, but now it felt different. Everything that had once seemed important gradually took a back seat, and I began to perceive it in a new, more conscious way. The time I spent searching for myself taught me to listen to myself, to be honest not only with others, but also with myself. When I looked back at the emptiness I had left behind, I wasn't afraid anymore. There was no regret, no pain. I understood that not every moment in life has to be tied to the past. Sometimes you just have to move forward, letting go of what prevents you from going further. I often thought about him, about the days when we were together. But now it wasn't a heavy memory. It was more like a part of my story. I had learned to let go. The understanding that we cannot hold everything in our hands gave me strength. I no longer searched in the past for what could not be returned. It didn't mean forgetting, It meant accepting that everything has its time. A new day always brought something unknown, and I learned to rejoice in even the little things. Walks in the parks, conversations with people, random encounters. They all became part of my new world. A world where I felt alive again, not limited by what had been before. Every morning, I woke up feeling that I was not the person who had left that house. I was different, stronger, more determined, but most importantly, I was authentic. In this new life, I began to see not only the traces of what I had been through, but also the new possibilities unfolding before me. I could become who I had always wanted to be, and this path was only mine.